At the far end of an estate auction nobody wanted to get close to, a Belgian Malinois pressed himself flat against a canvas duffel bag and would not move, not even for the woman who had just paid to take him home. The auctioneer had almost skipped the lot. Folding tables ran the length of the gravel yard behind the old training barracks, each one loaded with a dead soldier's belongings, sorted into cardboard flats, boots, a shaving kit, a stack of paperback westerns with the spines cracked. At the last table sat a wire crate, and inside it, a dog nobody had bid on twice. A handwritten sign was zip-tied to the crate door, "Not for sale, bites." The ink had bled where rain had gotten to it once, then dried. The tag should have pulled the lot from the floor entirely, but nobody had checked a box for that either. "Lot 41, the auctioneer said, without looking up from his clipboard. "K9, no papers on file, comes with handler's kit, do I have anything?" Nobody raised a hand. A man in a Carhartt jacket laughed under his breath and said something to the woman next to him about not wanting to lose a finger over a used dog leash. The crowd had already started drifting toward the next table, where somebody's fishing gear was laid out. Colette Hargrove stood at the back of the yard with her coat buttoned to the throat, holding a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She was 66 years old and had told herself, driving out here, that she only wanted to see it. Watch the tables get cleared, watch other people's hands go through what was left of a man's whole working life, and feel nothing more than she'd feel walking through a museum. She had not planned to bid on anything. The dog inside the crate had its whole body angled toward the far corner, where a second bag sat half open on the ground, olive canvas gone soft and gray at the seams. Every few seconds the dog's ribs would rise and fall in one long shudder, and its eyes would cut sideways, checking the bag was still there, before it went rigid again. Colette read the sign twice, "Bites." She had heard that word describe Silas exactly once, years ago, from a young corporal filling out paperwork who didn't know she was the wife. "Sergeant Hargrove bites when you get near his dogs." She'd laughed about it then. She wasn't laughing now. The auctioneer moved to close the lot. $50, Colette said. She heard her own voice before she understood she'd used it. Heads turned. The auctioneer looked up, pen stalled over the clipboard, like he was deciding whether to take her seriously. "Ma'am, this dog isn't $50, she said again, steadier the second time, though her hand had come up on its own and was still raised, fingers spread, like she was catching something falling. Nobody bid against her. The gavel came down on silence. They made her sign 3 separate release forms at a folding table by the gate, a young private reading each line aloud in a flat, tired voice. Liability, no warranty, dog surrendered as is. Colette's pen moved across the paper without her watching the words. Her hand was shaking by the second form. She hadn't touched anything of Silas's in 14 months, not his coat in the hall closet, not the boots by the back door she still stepped around instead of moving, and here she was, signing her name to bring one more piece of him through her front door. When they opened the crate, the dog did not run to her. It did not run at all. It crossed the 2 feet of gravel to the duffel bag, pressed its body flat against the canvas, and looked at her the way a soldier looks at someone walking toward a checkpoint. "You have to carry the bag," the private said, already backing away. "He won't leave it. We tried." Colette carried both, the bag over one shoulder, the leash cutting a thin line across her palm, out to the car, the dog pressed against her leg the whole way, never once looking back at the yard, only at the bag swinging against her hip. He climbed into the back seat without being told to. He did not lie down. He sat upright the entire drive, nose an inch from the canvas, and Colette watched him in the rearview mirror at every red light, asking herself, in the plain language she used for things she didn't understand, what exactly she had just brought home. The dog would not eat. Colette set the bowl down twice that first evening, once with plain kibble and once with a spoon of chicken broth stirred through it, and both times he looked at it, looked at her, and returned to the corner of the living room where she'd set the duffel bag because she hadn't known where else to put it. He lay down 3 feet from it, chin on his paws, eyes open. She had read the intake sheet on the drive home, the only piece of paper that had come with him besides the release forms. Name, Juniper, sex, male, age, approximately 6. Under notes, someone had written handler deceased and nothing else, as if that explained the whole animal, which, she was beginning to understand, it did. By 9 o'clock she gave up on the bull and sat down in Silas's recliner, the one piece of furniture in the house she still avoided out of habit more than grief, and watched the dog watch the bag. The house made its usual night sounds around her, the refrigerator cycling on, a branch scraping the gutter above the porch, the pipes ticking as the water heater cooled. Juniper's ears moved toward each one and then settled again, cataloging threats, dismissing them, one at a time. A neighbor's grandson had come by earlier with his mother, curious about the new dog, and gotten within 4 feet of the corner before Juniper rose onto his front legs, lip curling back off his teeth, in a sound that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. The boy's mother had grabbed his hand and left without finishing her coffee. Colette had apologized at the door and meant it, and also understood, in some part of her that surprised her, that she wasn't angry at the dog for it. She turned off the lamp near midnight and left him there, in the dark, guarding a bag of dead man's laundry. He was in the same spot in the morning. The bowl was untouched, a thin skin already forming over the broth. It went on that way for 3 days. Colette learned the geometry of the house through the dog's eyes, which doorways he'd block with his body, which windows made him stiffen, how far he'd let her walk before his ears went flat. She learned that he drank water only from the bowl nearest the corner, standing rather than kneeling, head up, eyes on the room the whole time. She learned that if she sat on the floor, not the chair, and stayed quiet, he'd eventually close his eyes, though never both at once, one ear always angled toward the corner. On the second day she tried talking to him, the way she used to talk to Silas across the kitchen table, without expecting much of an answer some mornings. She told him about the garden going to seed out back, about nothing in particular. He didn't respond to any of it, but by the second afternoon he'd started lifting his head when she came into a room instead of only when she got close. On the 4th night, she almost missed it. She'd gotten up for water around 11, moving slow in the dark so as not to wake him, and from the hallway she saw him rise, cross to the bag, and do something she hadn't seen before. He touched his nose to the canvas, lifted his head, touched it again, a 3rd time. Then he sat, spine straight, and turned his whole head to stare at the empty air where her hands would be if she were kneeling in front of him. He held the position for maybe 10 seconds, then he lay back down, as if nothing had happened. Colette stood in the hallway with a glass of water going warm in her hand, and did not move until her legs started to ache. She had spent 31 years married to a man who spoke fluent behaviors most people never learned to read, the particular way he'd tap 2 fingers on a table before saying something he didn't want to say, the pause before he lied about how a surgery had gone so she wouldn't worry, and some of that had rubbed off on her, whether she'd asked for it or not. What she'd just watched was not a tick, it had a shape, a start, and a middle, and an end, repeated exactly the way trained things repeat. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed running the sequence over in her head, 3 touches, a pause, the stillness, the stare, trying to fit it against anything Silas had ever mentioned about his work, and came up with nothing solid enough to hold on to. In the morning she made a decision she couldn't fully explain to herself, and knelt on the living room floor 3 feet from the bag, close enough that Juniper lifted his head and went still, watching her with the whole of his attention. She held out her hand, palm down, the way she'd seen Silas do it 100 times without ever asking him why. Juniper's ears came up. He did not growl, he did not move toward the bag or away from her. He simply looked at her hand, then at her face, then back at her hand, for what felt like a very long time. The clock in the kitchen ticked through 11 full seconds before anything in him moved at all. Then, for the first time since the auction yard, some of the tension went out of his shoulders, only a little of it, but enough that Colette noticed her own breath had been held the whole time and let it go slowly, so as not to startle him. She did not touch him, she didn't dare, not yet. She only knelt there while the coffee went cold on the counter behind her, watching a dog that had spent 4 days guarding a stranger's ghost, and asking herself, plainly, who had taught him to do that? Who taught you that? And why did it matter enough to remember when everything else about the last 6 years of his life had apparently been taken from him, one transfer at a time? The shed had been locked for 14 months, and Colette was the only one who had the key. She stood in front of it on the 6th evening with Juniper sitting at her side, unusually calm for that hour, as if he understood this was a place that mattered. He had started eating again, a little, since 2 nights before, though he still ate standing, facing the room instead of the bowl. The padlock had rusted slightly at the shackle. She'd bought it new the week after the funeral, back when locking the door had felt like the only decision she was capable of making that wasn't going to be wrong. Everyone had told her different things about grief in that first year. Her sister said to keep busy. Her doctor said to give it time. A woman at the church support group, kind but useless, said that when she was ready she'd know. Colette had settled on her own rule instead, quietly, without telling anyone. Nothing of Silas's would move, not his boots, not the coat in the hall closet she still stepped around instead of touching. Not one item in the shed where he'd kept 30 years of training gear, going back to before she'd even met him. If nothing moved, nothing could get worse. That was the whole of her theology since October of last year, and she had held to it the way other people held to Scripture, without ever once questioning whether it was true. He used to tease her, back when he was alive, and the shed was just a shed, that she'd never once set foot in it in 3 decades of marriage, and she used to tell him it was his one room in the world, and she intended to leave it that way. She'd said it lightly, the way you say things you don't expect to be held to. The key stuck the first time. She had to jiggle it, the way he used to, and the small familiar motion of her wrist, doing something he'd done 1,000 times, nearly undid her before she'd even opened the door. She stood there a moment with her forehead nearly against the wood, breathing, before she made herself turn it the rest of the way. Inside, the smell hit her first, cedar and old canvas, and something like machine oil that had probably faded years ago, but that her memory kept fresh regardless. Dust hung in the flashlight beam, turning slowly, undisturbed since the last time he'd swept through here himself. A workbench ran along one wall, tools still laid out in the order he'd left them, a coffee ring dried permanent into the wood beside the vise, as if he'd only stepped out for lunch and simply hadn't come back yet. A calendar was still tacked to the wall by the door, open to a month 14 years gone, one square circled in red pen for a vet appointment neither of them had ever needed to remember again. Juniper went in ahead of her and sat, without being told, in front of a stack of gray storage boxes near the back. She hadn't expected that. She stood there a moment, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand, then crossed the shed and knelt in front of the box he'd chosen. Training, reference, read the label. In Silas's block handwriting, the letters slanted the way they always slanted when he wrote in a hurry, a habit from 30 years of filling out reports between one task and the next. Her hand stopped over the lid for a long moment before she made herself lift it. The first thing inside was his training jacket, the canvas one, with the reinforced left sleeve, folded the way the army had taught him to fold everything, corners squared. She lifted it out, and it held its shape in her hands like it remembered his shoulders. There was a small tear at the cuff she recognized instantly. A German shepherd named Duke had done that, years ago, and Silas had worn the jacket anyway for another 2 winters rather than have it mended, calling the tear a medal nobody else would understand. She pressed it once against her face, without deciding to, and the smell was mostly dust now, mostly gone, but some thread of him was still in there, and that was enough to put her down on the shed's concrete floor, with her back against the workbench, crying in a way she hadn't let herself do since the burial detail folded a flag into a triangle and put it in her hands. Juniper came and lay down beside her, not touching, just close, his flank rising and falling in the same slow rhythm as her breath eventually found. She sat like that, long enough that the flashlight beam on the ceiling dimmed and steadied twice, and the cold from the concrete worked its way up through her coat, and none of it seemed important enough to move for. She sat there long enough for her knees to go stiff. When she finally pulled herself together, she went back through the box more carefully, notebooks with training logs in shorthand she couldn't decode, a stack of laminated cards with commands on them in 3 columns she didn't recognize, a coiled leather lid gone hard with age, a tin of dog treats so old they'd fused into a single brick. Beneath those, a handful of photographs she hadn't known existed, Silas younger than she'd ever seen him in person, kneeling in a training yard beside dogs whose names she'd never learned, squinting against a sun that had set on all of them decades ago. She turned each one over, looking for a name written on the back, and found nothing but dates, none of them matching Juniper's age. In a second box beneath the first, she found a thin stack of letters, bound with a rubber band gone brittle enough to snap when she touched it. Commendation letters, a handful of them, from families whose dogs Silas had trained, thanking him in the plain, grateful language of people who didn't know what else to say to a stranger who had changed something in their lives. She read 2 of them all the way through, before she made herself stop, aware that she was stalling now, using his good name to put off the harder question a little longer. Nothing that explained the gesture she'd seen 4 nights ago, nothing with Juniper's name on it at all. Whatever this dog had learned, it hadn't come from a page she could find in this box, and she went through 2 more boxes beneath it before she admitted to herself that she wasn't going to find it tonight, maybe not at all. She closed the lid without finding an answer, which felt, somehow, worse than not looking would have. At least before, the not knowing had been a closed door. Now it was an open box with nothing useful inside it, and a jacket in her lap that still smelled faintly of a man who wasn't going to explain anything to her ever again. She sat with the jacket a while longer, running her thumb along the torn cuff, before folding it back along its original creases and setting it gently on top of the box instead of inside it, unable to make herself bury it again completely. She was still sitting there, jacket across her knees, when her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She almost didn't check it. Whatever it was could wait until morning, she told herself, the way she told herself most things these days, and had told herself for 14 months running. But something made her look. A single new email, subject line in bold, notices, Department of Military Estate Liquidation. She set the jacket down on the workbench, carefully, the way you set down something that might still be sleeping, and read the sender's name twice before her stomach understood what her eyes already had. She read the email standing up, still in the shed. Silas's jacket dropped across the workbench where she'd forgotten it the moment the first line registered. Notice of recall, Canine Lot 41. It was addressed to her by name, her legal name, the one only banks and doctors used. Below the subject line, a block of formal language she had to read twice to fully understand. The canine designated Juniper had been released at auction in error prior to completion of a mandatory behavioral assessment required for civilian rehoming. The animal was to be surrendered within 7 calendar days, or the recipient, her, would be in violation of federal liquidation code and subject to further action. At the bottom, a signature block, Roland Falk, Coordinator, Military Estate Liquidation Division. Colette set the phone down on the workbench and picked it back up twice, as if reading it a third time might change one of the words. It didn't. 7 days. She counted backward through the date in her head, and then forward again, both times arriving at the same Friday, a week from tomorrow, the same day her sister had already asked her to come for lunch, back when a lunch invitation had been the biggest thing on her calendar. Juniper had followed her out of the shed, and now sat in the yard, watching her with the particular stillness he reserved for moments when something in the air had changed, and he hadn't yet decided how to respond to it. "It's nothing," she told him, and heard how thin her own voice sounded saying it. She called the number listed at the bottom of the email before she'd even gotten back inside the house, standing on the back step with the porch light throwing her shadow long across the grass. A recording told her the office was closed. She called again the next morning at 8 sharp and got transferred 4 times, Records Division, then Compliance, then someone who identified themselves only as an extension number, then a hold line that played the same 12 seconds of tinny music on a loop for 11 minutes before disconnecting entirely. On the second attempt, she finally reached a person who stayed on the line long enough to say something useful, a woman with a clipped, tired voice, who told her, without apparent malice, that recall notices weren't typically reversed once issued. "It's not that we don't care, ma'am," the woman said. "It's that the form doesn't have a box for that." Colette asked what box it did have. The woman read off a list: surrender confirmed, surrender pending, non-compliant, none of which had anything to do with a dog lying quietly at her feet. tail thumping once against the floor whenever Colette's voice rose even slightly during the call, as if he could hear the shape of the trouble in it without understanding a single word. By the third day, she had a name for every voice she'd spoken to, and a folder on the kitchen table, thick with printed policy pages she'd found on a government site, none of which told her anything she didn't already know from the email. Behavioral assessment required. She read the phrase so many times it stopped meaning anything, the way any word does if you say it enough times in a row, the sounds coming loose from the sense. There was a moment, late that third night, when she let herself consider the easier path, driving him back, signing whatever they wanted, letting the 7 days end quietly instead of fighting them. She got as far as picturing the drive, the crate, the same folding table where she'd first signed his release, before she looked over at him, asleep by the bag, one paw twitching through some dream she'd never know the shape of, and put the thought away like something she was ashamed to have picked up in the first place. On the fourth day, she sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way she used to draft letters for the hospital board back when she was still working, and wrote out an appeal by hand because the online form kept timing out before she reached the submit button. She wrote 3 drafts before she found a version that didn't sound like begging, crossing out the word please every time it crept in, replacing it with plainer sentences she could stand behind. She mailed it certified because someone at the hospital had taught her decades ago that certified mail was the only kind that couldn't be quietly lost, and stood at the post office counter longer than she needed to, watching the clerk stamp the receipt, as if watching would make the letter travel faster. Her sister called on the second day, and Colette let it go to voicemail, then called back that evening and gave a version of events flat enough that her sister didn't press. She wasn't ready yet to explain a dog she barely understood herself in language a person on the outside of the last 3 weeks could follow. It felt, oddly, like something she owed Juniper before she owed anyone else an explanation, the right to be understood correctly the first time, instead of summarized badly to spare herself a longer conversation. It was on the 4th day, going through the auction paperwork again for anything she might have missed, that she found the copy of the intake sheet from the yard, the same one, word for word, the private had read her at the folding table. And there, in the section marked Prior Documentation, a photograph of the crate. She hadn't looked closely at it before. She looked closely now. The sign was in the photo, not for sale, bites, zip-tied to the door, the ink bled where rain had gotten to it. Someone at the liquidation office had attached the same image to a different document. She found it 3 pages deeper in the printed policy stack, in a section titled Basis for Recall. A red circle had been drawn around the sign, and beneath it a typed note, handwritten warning present at time of sale, confirms unresolved behavioral risk, assessment waived in error. Colette sat very still at her own kitchen table for a long moment, the pages in front of her, the refrigerator humming in the next room, a car passing slow on the street outside, and understood, all at once, that the very thing which had made her stop at that last folding table, the thing that had felt, in the moment, almost like a message meant for her, was now the reason they were going to take him away. Somebody had written that sign as a warning. She still didn't know who, or why, or what it had actually been warning against, but whatever it had meant, it hadn't been read the way it was meant to be read. And now it was being used the way a stranger with a red pen decided it should be used, against a dog who had done nothing in this house except guard a bag, and once let a widow reach a hand toward him without pulling away. She picked up the phone one more time that afternoon and called every number in the folder, in order, starting again from the top, and got the same runaround, the same transfers, the same silence. Nobody she reached could tell her who Roland Falk was, beyond a name on a signature block, or how to appeal a recall notice, or whether 7 days meant 7 business days, or 7 days flat. Nobody seemed to know anything except that the deadline existed and that it was hers to meet, and every person she spoke with sounded, in their own way, relieved to pass her further down the line, to somebody else's desk. By evening, she had stopped making calls. She sat on the living room floor instead, in the spot that had become hers over the past week, 3 feet from where the duffel bag still sat in the corner, and Juniper came and lay down against her side without being asked, his weight solid and warm against her ribs. She put her arm around him. It was the first time she had, and he let her, head resting on her knee, eyes half closed, as if some part of him understood that whatever had just entered the house was worse than anything a stranger's hand near the bag had ever been. 7 days, she said out loud, to no one, to him, to the empty room, to the recliner in the corner that still held its shape from a man who wasn't going to sit in it again. We have 7 days to prove you're not what they think you are. She didn't know yet what proof would even look like. She only knew, sitting there with a dog's heartbeat against her arm and a stack of government paperwork spread across the coffee table, that she was not going to sign another release form, not this time. Whatever it cost her, whatever rule of her own quiet mourning she'd have to break to do it, she was going to find out what that sign on the crate had actually meant before somebody with a red pen decided it for both of them. Outside, the porch light buzzed once and steadied. Juniper's ear twitched toward the sound and then went still again, and in the silence that followed, Colette understood that the 7-day clock in her chest had already started running, whether she was ready or not. The inspector arrived on the 5th of the 7 days, a woman named Patricia Voss, with a clipboard and a lanyard and a manner Colette recognized from 30 years of hospital administrators, polite in the way that meant the decision had already been made before she walked in the door. Colette had spent 2 days getting ready for this. She'd swept the living room twice. She'd moved the recliner to open up space so the inspector could see Juniper wasn't cornered, wasn't caged, wasn't anything but a dog lying quietly by a window. She'd rehearsed, out loud in the kitchen, how she'd explain the touching the bag business without making it sound stranger than it was. She'd even set out a small plate of cookies on the coffee table, an old instinct from decades of hosting visiting nurses and caseworkers, as if hospitality might somehow tip the scales in a form she hadn't yet learned the shape of. She had, she believed, done everything right. Voss walked the perimeter of the room first, writing as she went, her pen scratching in short bursts, and Juniper tracked her with his eyes but didn't rise from his spot near the bag. Good, Colette thought. Good boy, stay there. He seems settled, Voss said, and for 1 full minute Colette let herself believe the visit might actually go well. Voss even asked, almost conversationally, how long Colette had had him, whether he slept through the night, whether he'd shown any interest in toys. Colette answered each question carefully, watching the pen move across the clipboard, trying to read upside-down handwriting she couldn't quite make out from across the room. She mentioned the touching the bag business exactly once, softened into something closer to a habit than a mystery, and watched Voss write 2 words she couldn't decipher and move on without asking a follow-up question, which Colette chose to take as a good sign. For a few minutes it felt almost like the home visits she remembered from her own working life, the kind where a checklist mattered less than whether the room felt cared for, and she let herself believe, for those few minutes, that she knew how to pass this kind of inspection. Then Voss crossed to the corner to photograph the duffel bag for the file, official procedure, she explained, documenting the animal's environment, and reached down to move it 2 inches to get a better angle on the light. Juniper was on his feet before Colette's own body had finished registering the movement. The growl came from somewhere low in his chest, a sound with no beginning she could locate, already at full volume by the time it reached the air, and he lunged the half-step between himself and Voss's outstretched hand, fast enough that the woman staggered backward into the bookshelf, clipboard clattering to the floor, a framed photograph toppling off the shelf beside her and cracking its glass against the baseboard. Colette was between them in the same second, one arm across Juniper's chest, the other hand flat against his shoulder, saying his name in a voice pitched low and steady even though her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her ears. He didn't bite, he didn't even make contact. But he didn't stop either, not until Voss had backed all the way to the front door, hand pressed to her collarbone, breathing fast, eyes wide in a way that made her look, for just a moment, much younger than her lanyard suggested. "I'm sorry," Colette said. "I'm so sorry. He's not like that with me. He's never—" "I saw what I needed to see," Voss said, already writing, not looking up. Colette tried once more, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's protecting something, that's all this is." If you'd let me show you the way he does it when nobody's rushing him. But Voss was already gathering her things, the moment for showing anybody anything having closed the instant the growl started. She left without finishing her coffee, the same as the neighbor's daughter-in-law had, weeks earlier, except this time there was a form involved, and the form had boxes, and Colette watched through the front window as Voss sat in her car in the driveway for 4 full minutes, filling something out, before pulling away. Colette sat down hard in the recliner she'd moved out of the way, sat in Silas's chair for the first time in 14 months without noticing she'd done it, and put her face in both hands. Juniper came and pressed himself against her legs, and she found she wasn't angry at him, not even a little. Her hands went still in her lap. She knew, now, exactly what he'd been protecting, and exactly how badly it had just backfired. Aggressive response confirmed during behavioral observation, the report would say, 3 days later, when she finally got a copy mailed to her. Handler's account inconsistent with observed risk. Recommend proceeding with recall as scheduled. She had made it worse. Every instinct that had told her this dog deserved a chance had just handed the government a signed document proving the opposite. She spent that evening picking shards of glass out of the carpet where the frame had shattered, and found, underneath the sofa, the photograph itself, Silas in his dress uniform, 31 years old in the picture, grinning at whoever had been holding the camera, and set it on the mantel without a frame, because she didn't trust herself to go looking for a replacement just then. She sat up long past midnight rereading the report on her phone, the blue light the only light in the room, trying to find one sentence in it that had room for what she'd actually watched happen, and not finding one. Somewhere in that same sleepless hour, on impulse, she didn't examine too closely. She'd propped her phone against a stack of books and recorded 31 seconds of Juniper at the bag, the same sequence she'd watched a dozen times now, and posted it to the only place she could think to ask a real question, a canine handlers group her neighbor had mentioned once, full of strangers who might actually know a dog's body, the way Silas had. She didn't expect an answer. She only wanted, she realized as she typed the caption, to stop carrying the question alone. 3 states away, in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee, a man named Briar Ostrander was scrolling through a canine handlers group on his phone during a 15-minute lunch he wasn't going to finish eating. He almost kept scrolling past the post. A woman he didn't know had put up a short video 3 days earlier, 31 seconds long, captioned, "Does anyone recognize this behavior? Adopted this dog from an estate auction, and he does this every night, no idea what it means." The video had 40 comments, most of them useless. "He's just anxious. Try a vet behaviorist. Looks aggressive tbh, get him checked." Briar watched the clip once out of habit, more than curiosity. Then he watched it again, and sat up straighter on the break room bench, his sandwich forgotten beside him, half unwrapped. The dog in the video crossed to a bag on the floor, touched his nose to it, lifted his head, touched it again, a third time, then sat and turned to stare, unblinking, at the hand of whoever was filming. Briar's coffee went cold in his hand. He knew that sequence. He had performed that exact sequence himself, years ago, at 19 years old, standing in a training yard while a sergeant with iron-gray hair and a voice that never rose above a certain volume walked him through it, over and over, until his own hands had it memorized without his brain needing to be involved at all. He could still see the yard, early spring, mud still frozen in the ruts, his own breath fogging in front of him, and hear the man's voice correcting him without ever raising it. "Watch the eyes before the hand," he'd say. "The dog reads your eyes before it reads your hand." He'd made Briar repeat the gesture 14 times that first morning, and on the 15th had simply nodded once and walked away, which had been, from Sergeant Hargrove, the closest thing to praise any of them ever got. He hadn't thought about the man in longer than he wanted to admit. Hadn't let himself, mostly because the last time he'd seen him alive, he'd meant to say something and hadn't found the words, and then there wasn't a version of the world anymore where he'd get another chance. He remembered, sitting there in the break room, the exact spot in the parking lot where he'd almost turned around and gone back inside the hospital that last week, and how he'd told himself there would be a better time, a quieter one, and how there hadn't been. He read the caption again. Estate auction. He looked at the top of the video, at the small username beside the upload, and his thumb hovered over it for a long moment before he tapped to open her profile, Colette Hargrove. Briar sat very still in the break room, his lunch break ticking down on the clock above the coffee machine, and typed out a message with his thumbs shaking slightly on the screen, deleting it twice before he let himself send the third version. "I think I know what your dog is trying to say." Roland Falk arrived at 11 in a government sedan with a dent in the rear bumper on the 6th of the 7 days to conduct what his email had called a final compliance review before the recall took effect. He was younger than Colette had pictured from his voice on the 2 calls she'd finally managed to get through to him directly, mid-50s, she guessed, with the tired posture of a man who spent most of his working life delivering news nobody wanted. He carried a folder under one arm and did not sit when she offered him the sofa, only stood near the door in a way that told her he intended this to be short, his eyes moving once, briefly, to Juniper by the window, cataloging him the way Voss had, though with less obvious unease. "Mrs. Hargrove, I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "I've read Ms. Voss's report. I've read the original documentation from the sale. I don't take pleasure in this. But the animal was released without proper assessment, and the behavior reported since supports the original concern. I'm here to finalize surrender." Colette had a speech prepared. She had practiced it in the bathroom mirror the night before, every word chosen to sound calm instead of desperate, timed so it wouldn't run past 2 minutes because she'd read somewhere that people stopped listening after 2 minutes of anything. She had a line ready about 31 years of army life, about what it meant to lose a man and then almost lose the last living piece of him inside a week, and she'd practiced saying it without her voice breaking on the word husband. She opened her mouth to deliver it, and that was the exact moment the doorbell rang. She looked at Falk. Falk looked at his watch, visibly irritated by the interruption, and gestured for her to answer it, since clearly whatever she'd been about to say was going to happen regardless of who was at the door. "Go ahead," he said, with the particular patience of a man who has learned to expect his schedule to be interrupted and has stopped being surprised by it, only tired. Briar Ostrander stood on the porch in a jacket that still had a unit patch stitched to the sleeve, a manila envelope pressed flat against his chest with both hands like he was afraid the wind might take it. He was younger than Colette expected, and looked, in the half-second before either of them spoke, like a man standing at the edge of something he badly wanted to turn around and walk away from. He'd driven most of a day after his shift ended, stopping only for gas, still in the same undershirt he'd worn under his uniform that morning, a detail Colette would only learn later when he apologized for how he must have looked showing up unannounced. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said. "My name's Briar Ostrander. I trained under your husband. I'm sorry to just show up. I tried calling twice. He stopped, seeing Falk over her shoulder in the hallway. "Is this a bad time?" "It's the only time I have," Colette said, and stepped back to let him in. Falk's patience was visibly thinning by the time the 3 of them were standing in the living room, Juniper pressed flat against Colette's leg, watching the new stranger with an alertness that hadn't yet decided whether to be a threat. Falk checked his watch again, a small mechanical gesture that had clearly worn a groove into his day, one he performed without seeming to notice he was doing it. "Mrs. Hargrove, I have another appointment." 2 minutes, Briar said. "That's all I'm asking." He opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady and pulled out a few photocopied pages, the paper slightly yellowed, corners worn soft, the way old documents get when they've been pulled out and refiled many times over many years. He laid them on the coffee table and turned them so Falk could read. "This isn't a training manual," Briar said. "This is an internal unit bulletin. Restricted circulation. It went to K9 handlers only, inside the unit, never released to any civilian liquidation office, because there was never any reason it would need to be. Sergeant Hargrove wrote it himself, 6 years ago, after another dog from our unit got rehomed too fast and hurt somebody in the family that took him. He built a protocol so it wouldn't happen again." Falk hadn't moved to pick up the pages yet. "I'm listening. Your report says the dog is aggressive because he growls when people go near a bag," Briar said. "I watched a video of him doing something else entirely. Touching that bag with his nose 3 times, then sitting and staring at somebody's open hand. That's not aggression. That's a test. It's in here." He tapped the top page without opening it further, as if he wasn't yet ready to watch someone else read Silas's own handwriting for the first time. Sergeant Hargrove trained that sequence into every dog that came through advanced placement for exactly this situation, so that if he wasn't around to vouch for them himself, the dog could still show somebody who deserved the chance to prove it. Falk was quiet for a long moment, standing with his weight shifted onto one foot, the folder of forms still tucked under his arm, as though he hadn't yet decided whether to trust his own hands enough to set it down. Then, without a word, he crossed to the coffee table, sat down on the edge of it, and picked up the first page. Colette watched his face while he read, watched the particular stillness settle over him, the stillness of a man reconsidering something he'd been certain of an hour ago. He read slowly. He turned the first page over, then stopped, and read a line on the second page twice, his lips moving very slightly, the way people read when the words matter more than they expected them to. Nobody in the room spoke. Juniper had gone quiet at Colette's leg, watching all three of them now, instead of just Briar, as if he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that the air in the room had shifted, the way it had shifted the day the recall email arrived, except in the opposite direction this time. Falk finally looked up, the page still in his hand, and when he spoke his voice had lost the flat administrative tone from the doorway entirely. "Where did you get this?" "From a handler who kept a copy after our unit disbanded. I've had it 11 years and never had a reason to pull it out until 3 days ago." He didn't say the rest of it out loud, that he and Silas had traded a call or a text every few months since, the way you do with the one sergeant who never let you quit, in case it was ever needed and never was, until now. "And you're certain this is authentic? Not something reconstructed from memory, not a draft that never went out?" Falk's voice had the flat caution of a man who had been burned once before by evidence that looked solid and wasn't. "I was in the room when he wrote the final version, sir. Watched him proof it twice before it went to the printer. I'd know his handwriting blind." Falk looked down at the bulletin again, then at Colette, then at Juniper, still pressed against her leg, still watching him with that same unreadable stillness that had gotten a woman thrown against a bookshelf 3 days earlier. Falk said, to both of them, though it came out more like a request than an order, "All three of us, I want to read this from the beginning." He didn't reach for his folder of forms again. He set it on the floor beside him instead, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, he looked less like a man closing a file and more like one who had just realized he might be holding the wrong one. Outside, the light had shifted a full shade toward evening without any of them noticing it move. The three of them sat around the coffee table for the better part of an hour, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the floor, while Falk read the bulletin aloud in pieces and Briar filled in the parts the paper didn't say. 6 years earlier, a Malinois named Cobalt had gone home with a family that adopted him within a week of his handler's discharge. No waiting period, no transition. The dog had been fine for 11 days. On the 12th, a neighbor's child had grabbed at a training bag left by the back door, the way children do, without knowing what it meant to the dog guarding it, and the dog had bitten, a minor wound, 4 stitches, and a lot of paperwork. The dog was taken from the family anyway, because nobody involved understood there had been a warning sign the whole time, if anyone had known to look for it. Briar said Silas had driven 6 hours to the hearing on his own time, off the books, and hadn't been able to change the outcome, only to sit in the back row and watch it happen. Silas had sat with that outcome for a long time, Briar said. He'd requested a meeting with Unit Command and proposed something nobody had asked him for, a behavioral marker, trained into every dog that passed through advanced placement from then on, something simple enough that a dog could perform it under stress, and specific enough that it couldn't be mistaken for random anxiety by anyone who'd been told what to look for. 3 touches to whatever object the dog was guarding, then stillness, then direct eye contact with an open, offered hand. He called it the vouching gesture, Briar said. His words, he said a dog can't explain who taught them to trust, but they can show you if you know how to watch. He drilled it into every one of us who came through that unit. Made us practice it blindfolded once, just so we'd learn to feel the dog's weight shift instead of relying on our eyes. Colette found herself leaning forward, unable to help it. He never told me any of this. 31 years, and he never once mentioned a dog named Cobalt, or a protocol, or any of it. It wasn't an accusation. It came out closer to wonder, the particular ache of learning, after a marriage that long, that the person you thought you knew completely had still been carrying pieces of himself you'd never gotten to see. She remembered nights he'd come home late from the unit, quiet through dinner, and she'd assumed it was just the job, the ordinary weight of the work, never once imagining a specific dog, a specific hearing, a specific failure he'd been carrying alone, rather than bring it home to her. She remembered, too, one particular October evening years back when he'd sat at the kitchen table without eating, turning his fork over and over without lifting it. And she'd let him have his silence because that was the arrangement they'd built their whole marriage on. His work stayed at the fence line, and she never asked what jumped it. He wouldn't have. Breyer said gently, "That's not a knock on you, ma'am. That's just who he was. He carried the ones that went wrong so nobody else had to." He looked down at his own hands for a moment before he added, quieter, "I used to think I owed him a thank you I never got to say. Turns out he already said it back, 6 years early, and I'm only just now catching up to it." Falk turned to the third page and read the paragraph Colette would come back to, later, more than any other line in the whole bulletin. For dogs rehomed after a handler's death or discharge without transition, mark the transport crate with a plain warning at time of surrender, not for sale, bites. This is not a claim of aggression. It is a field code, unit personnel only, meaning this animal requires the vouching protocol before placement. Any handler or unit member present at liquidation will recognize the phrase and hold the lot. Civilian buyers will read it as caution and, more often than not, will stay back, which is the intended effect until the correct person arrives to complete the test. Falk read it twice. The second time, out loud, slower, and when he finished he set the page down and didn't say anything for a moment that stretched long enough that Colette heard her own heartbeat in the quiet and the low tick of the clock on the mantel counting past the hour. He wrote a warning label, Falk finally said, that was supposed to keep the wrong hands off and hold the dog for the right ones. Not a hazard sign, a gate. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the page, the way a man does when he's trying to feel a truth instead of just read it. "I've been doing this job 9 years. I don't think I've ever once read a document and had it change my mind mid-sentence. This one did it twice." "And nobody in your office ever saw this bulletin," Breyer said, "because it never left the unit. It was never meant to be filed anywhere civilian records could reach." "So the same 3 words that got him surrendered to a woman willing to stop and read them," Colette said quietly, "were the words your office used to try to take him back from her." It wasn't quite a question. Nobody answered it as one. Colette had been quiet through most of the reading, one hand resting on Juniper's back the whole time, feeling the tension in him rise and fall, as if he too were following some thread of it he couldn't fully name. Now she looked down at him and understood, in a rush that left her breathless, exactly what she'd been living with for 3 weeks. He hadn't been guarding a bag out of grief or confusion or a broken temperament nobody had bothered to fix. He'd been waiting, doing the only thing he knew how to do, to tell someone, anyone, that he was ready to be trusted, if only they'd stay still long enough to let him show them. 6 years, 3 transfers, a stranger's living room floor, and the whole time he'd been holding a door open, in the one language nobody had thought to translate for him. She thought of every stranger who'd come near that bag since the auction, the neighbor's grandson, Voss with her clipboard, even herself, that first night, and understood that every single one of them had failed a test they never knew they were taking, except for her, on the 4th morning, on the living room floor. "Can I try it?" she said. The gesture. "Can you show me exactly, so I do it right?" Breyer walked her through it slowly, correcting the angle of her wrist once, telling her to let her shoulders drop before she offered her hand, and she knelt on the living room floor for the second time in 3 weeks, this time with 2 men watching instead of no one, and reached toward the duffel bag with a hand that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last hour without her noticing. Juniper rose, crossed to the bag, touched his nose to the canvas, once, a pause, twice. A longer pause, his eyes flicking to her face and back. A third time. Then he sat, spine straight, and turned to look directly at her open hand, and held there, perfectly still, for the 10 longest seconds of Colette's year. She reached out and rested her palm against the side of his face, and he leaned into it, the whole weight of his head coming to rest against her hand, eyes half closing, in a way he had not done once in 3 weeks of careful, watchful distance. Somewhere behind her she heard Briar exhale, a long breath he seemed to have been holding since he'd first opened the envelope. For a moment nobody in the room moved at all. Briar had his hand pressed over his mouth. Falk sat very still with the bulletin's last page still open in his lap, looking at the dog and the widow the way a man looks at something he understands. Now, he'd gotten backward from the start. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street, ordinary and distant, the kind of sound that belonged to a version of the afternoon none of them were living in anymore. It was Falk who finally broke the silence, standing up, the pages gathered carefully back into their folder, his voice quieter than it had been at any point since he'd walked through the door that morning. "This explains the sign," he said. "It explains the behavior." He looked down at the folder in his hands, at the recall order still clipped inside it behind the bulletin pages, and something in his face shifted, the beginning of a decision he hadn't fully made yet. "What it doesn't do," he added, and Colette felt her stomach drop even as her hand stayed resting against Juniper's head, "is fix the recall order sitting on my desk right now, with my signature on it, dated 4 days ago." Falk didn't leave right away. He stood in the doorway with the folder under his arm for a long moment, looking back at the room like a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the shape of. "Give me until tomorrow," he said finally. "I need to check something and I can't do it from my phone." He drove straight back to the liquidation office instead of home, past the hour most of the building had already cleared out for the evening, and let himself into the records room with the master key he'd carried on his belt for 9 years without ever once needing it for anything past a filing dispute over furniture. Military unit archives didn't route through his system automatically. That had never bothered him before. His office handled civilian disposition, estate sales, liquidation of personal property, a separate world from the operational archives kept by the units themselves, walled off by design, because nobody had ever needed the two to talk to each other. 2 systems, built at 2 different times, by 2 different chains of command, never once required to reconcile. He requested the archive search through the unit liaison line, gave Silas Hargrove's name and the approximate date, and waited 40 minutes in an empty office with a vending machine coffee going cold at his elbow before an email came back with a scanned document attached. The bulletin. The same one, word for word, the header stamped with a distribution code he recognized from nowhere in his own filing system because it had never been sent to his filing system. Restricted. Unit personnel only. A field code buried in an archive his office had no standing procedure to ever search unless someone happened to already know, by some other means entirely, that it existed. Falk sat with that for a while. He had built his whole career on the belief that the paperwork protected people, that if everyone followed the process would catch what needed catching. He had tightened his own procedures years ago after a case that still occasionally kept him up at night, a rehoming that went wrong because somebody skipped a step, and he had promised himself, quietly, that it would never happen on his desk again. He'd meant that promise as armor. Tonight it had turned around and pointed at him instead. The gap hadn't been a mistake anyone made. Nobody had been careless. The gap was simply a seam nobody had noticed between a system built to protect soldiers and a system built to liquidate their belongings, and a dog had fallen straight through it, carrying a message nobody on the civilian side had ever been given the key to read. He printed the archive record, stapled it to his own recall file, and drove to Colette's house the next morning before he'd let himself second-guess it. She opened the door already dressed, Juniper at her side, and something in her face told him she'd been awake most of the night the same as he had. "I found it," he said, holding up the printed page before she could ask. "Restricted Unit Archive, never linked to civilian liquidation records." That's not a gap in your husband's paperwork, Mrs. Hargrove. That's a gap in mine. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive over, the particular fatigue of a man revising an opinion he had built his whole working life around. He set both files on her kitchen table. Side by side, the recall order with his own signature and the archive confirmation with a distribution code that predated the auction by 6 years, and signed a second document beneath the first, a waiver form he'd printed himself before leaving the office, releasing Juniper from any further behavioral assessment, effective immediately. "I'm going to recommend the two systems get cross-linked," he said, capping his pen. "Any future estate sale involving a working dog gets flagged against the unit archive before it ever reaches auction. I don't know how many other dogs this has happened to. I intend to find out." Colette looked at the signed waiver for a long moment before she trusted her own voice. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went further back than the last 7 days. Falk nodded once, gathered his folder, and paused at the door on his way out, looking down at Juniper, who had come to sit at Colette's feet without being called, calm in a way Falk hadn't seen in any of the 3 visits he'd made to this house. "For what it's worth," he said, "I spent 9 years thinking the process was the thing that kept people safe. Today I learned the process can be exactly what needs fixing." He let himself out without waiting for a reply, the way a man does when he's said the truest thing he has and doesn't trust himself to add anything after it. Colette closed the door behind him and knelt down on the floor of her own living room, in the spot that had become hers, and put both arms around Juniper's neck. "You don't have to guard the bag anymore," she said, into the fur behind his ear, and felt him lean the whole of his weight into her, the way he had never once let himself do in 3 weeks of standing watch. A week later, Colette unlocked the shed for the second time that month, and this time she opened every box. She didn't put anything back the way she'd found it. She hung the training jacket on a nail where the window light would catch it. She lined the laminated command cards along a shelf. She set a framed photograph of Silas, young and grinning in his uniform, beside a stack of his notebooks, spines out. Last, she took the canvas duffel bag, cleaned now, the auction yard dirt scrubbed from its seams, and hung it from a hook above the workbench, empty, no longer something that needed guarding. Juniper came in while she was still standing back to look at what she'd made, not a shrine sealed off from the world, but a corner of it, open, part of the shed she'd use again come spring. He crossed the floor, sat beneath the bag, and lay down, chin on his paws, in the spot he might once have defended. His body was loose now, eyes half shut in the light. Colette sat down on the workbench stool beside him and found herself smiling without having to work at it. She rested her hand between his shoulder blades, and he sighed once, long and low, the last of the guard going out of him, and let his eyes close all the way for the first time since the auction yard.